interesting discussions at Kiddush and so on, but may not know that Josh is also quite the expert on politics and policy, and is a professor of politics and policy all over town, and a fellow at think tanks, and really such a tremendous asset to our community, not only as a mensch and as a wonderful guy, but also as somebody who has really their finger on the pulse of what's going on in the world. And I'm really excited to hear from you, Josh, about what's going on in the world and what's going to happen with the new administration, and what can we expect in terms of Israel and relation with the Jews, and all kinds of agenda items. So I will leave it to you. I'm going to ask everybody to mute themselves, please. And if Josh, if you'd like to let us know how you'd like to take questions throughout, or at the end, or in the chat, whatever is going to be the best for you. So I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was very sweet and overly generous introduction. And everyone here is a friend of mine, which is a nice setting to give a talk in. I've given talks in the opposite kind of setting, and this is very much preferable. I said overly generous because I feel as if I have my finger on the pulse of politics as it was up until 4 years ago. Politics of the past. The current world is harder for me to make sense of. We haven't, but let me leap into this subject because it's on everybody's mind. In particular, the new administration in Israel and what it may portend. You know, there were public opinion polls in Israel running up to the election, which showed that Israelis preferred Trump over Biden overwhelmingly. The last poll I saw had Trump at 63% and Biden at 17%. So almost 4-1. And it is not hard to understand that Trump was a very pro-Israel president, and he did a lot of things that Israel wanted, including notably moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, giving the back of the hand really to the PLO. You know, he ordered the closing of the PLO offices in Washington, also closed the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem, which had been the de facto U.S. embassy to the Palestinians. His peace plan that was unveiled very late in his presidency smiled upon annexation by Israel of large amounts of land in the West Bank, and would have awarded roughly 30% of the West Bank to Israel. And also he withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal, which was very unpopular with the Israeli government and most Israelis. And so he struck quite a dramatic contrast with his predecessor, President Obama, who had a very tense and unfriendly relationship with Netanyahu, whereas Trump and Netanyahu really seem to hit it off extremely well. And President Obama had given a feeling, I think, throughout his presidency of a kind of impatience with Israel that Trump never showed. And so it's easy to understand, I think, why Israelis were so overwhelmingly favorable to Trump in the election. What will Biden now do? I think Biden will reverse some, but not all of these things that Trump did that were popular in Israel. He will not undo the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. He will not move the embassy away from Jerusalem, nor will he undo the recognition of Israeli sovereignty on the Golan. He will not carry forward or embrace the Trump administration's peace plan and its approval of annexations. And he will probably undo the measures that were antithetical to the PLO, or the Palestinian Authority. I would expect that we will reopen the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem and allow for a reopening of the Palestinian offices in Washington and resume aid to the Palestinians, which had been cut off by the Trump administration. I don't think any of those things, by the way, are likely to cause a great deal of dismay in Israel. I think they were not terribly important things. But the bigger issue will be his declared determination to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. And that, if it happens, is bound to be a source of pain for Israel and perhaps a source of danger to Israel. But I think even as Biden can be expected to do some things that will be problematic for Israel, Biden, despite making a big deal when he was fighting for the nomination of speaking of the Obama-Biden administration, Biden is not Obama. He's a different kind of politician. And in particular, I think Biden can be contrasted with Obama in respect to some of the sources of the friction and really often nasty atmosphere that prevailed between Washington and Israel during the Obama years. Obama had a certain ideological background. Surprisingly, Obama came from a background of the what the Brits call the hard left, the extreme left. He had in his early years, he had very close association with, believe it or not, the figures in the Communist Party in the United States. And then in his young adult years, he was a close colleague of Bill Ayers, who was a leader of a real authentic domestic terrorist group, the so-called Weather Underground of the 60s, for those who remember. And Obama had chosen the Reverend Jeremiah White as his minister, someone who both was an anti-Semite and hated America. And I don't dredge this all up to suggest that Obama was, during his presidency, some kind of secret or closet communist, but he did have, in his formative years, and really lasting for a few decades, he was immersed in this extremist universe, which always made me wonder about some of the mental furniture that was left in his head, even though I think he had clearly outgrown the views of that milieu. And on top of that, Obama also, I think, came to the presidency thinking that we had a terrible problem of relations with the Muslim world, and that this had been largely of our own creation by overreaction to 9/11 and by Bush's global war on terror, and that he had a mission to repair our relations with the Muslim world. And so you may recall Obama gave his first television interview to which network? Al Arabiya in Arabic. And his first international trip and major speech was to the Middle East, where his central speech was in Cairo. And on that trip, he pointedly, although visiting several countries, refused to stop in Israel. And he told an American Jewish group that visited him at the White House around that time that he thought it was important for him to put daylight between himself and Israel, which he certainly did. Uh, uh, in Biden, we have a very different kind of politician. First of all, ideologically, Biden is a kind of old-fashioned liberal. He has none of that association with the radical left that Obama had, and like other old-fashioned liberals, Biden's record for many decades is very pro-Israel. He calls himself a Zionist, and he just has none of the baggage that Obama had that made relations so tense between the U.S.
That's true. He was not friendly to Israel, Obama.
He also doesn't have this, as he had during his second, as Obama had during his second term, John Kerry as Secretary of State, who was
Jerk.
also someone who I think had very bad chemistry with Israel and who was uh, oddly fixated on good relations with Bashar Assad. The on top of this, Biden is sort of surrounded by Jews to a ridiculous extent. That is, he has 3 grown children, all 3 of whom are or were married to Jews, meaning Biden's grandchildren are Jews. And as if that weren't enough, Kamala Harris is married to a Jew. On top of that, the appointments that he's made so far to the leading positions in his administration have been, I would say, you could say embarrassingly heavy in Jews. That is, the new Secretary of State is a Jew, the new Deputy Secretary of State is a Jew, the new Secretary of the Treasury is a Jew, the new head of the Department of Homeland Security is a Jew, the new head of intelligence, the director of national intelligence is a Jew. I don't know how many others. I happen to have been these weeks immersed in a long article I've recently completed about QAnon, this crazy ultra-right group that was involved in the invasion of the Capitol and in other nutty stuff. And so I've spent time in their message boards or whatever, where there's lots of very raw anti-Jewish, pro-Nazi stuff. And but I spotted there one clever message by one anti-Semite, which said Biden's cabinet is the most diverse in history. It's got men and women, native born and immigrants, whites and Latinos, but they're all Jews. And of course, this was pointed out by an anti-Semite, but it happened to be perfectly accurate. And by the way, about Kamala Harris, in addition to her husband being a Jew, she is, when the ticket was put together, she was presumably to some degree Biden's left flank. That is, he was from the party center, and she was presumably more representing the party's left. And it is the party's left which is least friendly to Israel, but her record in the Senate is not at all unfriendly to Israel, to the contrary, to the point that in her last election campaign, J Street, which calls itself pro-Israel, but mostly devotes itself to doing anti-Israel things, refused to endorse her, although it endorsed most Democratic candidates, but it refused to endorse her because she was too consistently on Israel's side. So all of this doesn't mean that there won't be conflicts between the new administration and and the Israeli government. I think there will be, and there will be policies that may make us worried or unhappy as Jews who are, I think everyone in this group feels very supportive of Israel. But I don't think that there'll be anything like the difficult atmosphere that there was during the Obama years. The difficulties will, of course, revolve around two questions. One is relations with the Palestinians or the peace process, and the other will be the Iran nuclear deal, or the more general question of Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions. In regard to the Palestinians, I think this is something where there will be some frictions, but it's, in my judgment, much less to be worried about. Biden, despite his long record of being a supportive of Israel, also has, going back many years already, often expressed criticism of settlement expansion in the West Bank. And that is bound to be a continued sore point in U.S.-Israel relations. And there's no doubt that Biden and this administration will have a strong commitment to a two-state solution, that is, to the creation of a Palestinian state. And that's something that Netanyahu has in the past rhetorically embraced, but he's also made clear that he doesn't have a lot of enthusiasm for it. And there are other parties and political figures in Israel to the right of Netanyahu who are seen to be likely to be even stronger than today in coming elections, that are against the idea of a two-state solution. And so there will be some frictions, but I don't think they will be very severe. And I don't think they'll be very severe because the issue of settlements, which is the immediate point of sometimes conflict and sometimes anger, is a subordinate issue to this larger question of the peace process and two-state solution. And I think that is pretty much off the agenda. I think that it's off the agenda in reality because the Palestinians are not, they're in complete disarray. There is this continuing insoluble split between Fatah and Hamas in the West Bank and Gaza, with no sign. I mean, they've had 18 reconciliations in the last whatever number of years, and the reconciliations, last until they leave the room or something. It just doesn't happen. They also really, both the Fatah and the Hamas regimes rest on dubious legitimacy. Abbas is now in the the 15th or 16th year of his 5-year term, and there's a very great doubt about his popularity, as well as that of the other political forces. And there's a dramatically new context, which is that the rest of the Arab world, which had always said in the past, we can't consider making peace with Israel until there's peace, Israel makes peace with the Palestinians. The rest of the Arab world now has started making peace with Israel. And there is no chance that the Biden administration is going to look upon the Abraham Accords, as they're called, and say, oh, that's something that Trump did, we're going to turn our backs on it. On the contrary, they've already said very clearly they applauded and want to build on it. And I think it's quite possible, even likely, that a couple of the other Arab states, maybe Qatar, maybe Oman, and conceivably others, will also be joining this peace process. And in this context, where there's a new chapter of peacemaking between Israel and the Arabs, I don't think that the US administration is going to see the Israel-Palestinian peace process as the sort of sine qua non of Middle East peace, and is going to be interested in having a lot of conflict with Israel over the Israel-Palestinian peace process, which, if not moribund, is in a very weak and kind of nowhere state, whereas these other very productive things are happening in the region. And that brings me to the other problem, which will be a much more serious source of friction, or is likely to be, and that's the Iran nuclear agreement. That it was the cornerstone of Obama's foreign policy. Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement, much to a lot of dismay, including in Europe and elsewhere. And Biden has said again and again he wants to rejoin it. And we have numerous reports that there already are behind the scenes conversations between representatives of the Biden administration and Iranian officials. Nonetheless, and I would say, just to be clear where I'm coming from, I'm very skeptical of this agreement. I was against it when it was struck, and I don't think I think it's kind of a snare. But I'm not as worried about this as I might be, or at least I'm not worried yet, for a couple of reasons. One is, although there is a real difference of opinion, the Biden administration has gone out of its way to make clear that it doesn't want to have conflict with Israel over this. So when Tony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, had his confirmation hearings, in his testimony, he said about moving forward with relations with Iran over this over the nuclear agreement that we want our allies to be in on our policy to want to do it in consultation with our allies, and we want them to be, he used the phrase, to be in on the takeoff as well as the landing. And then he specified Israel and the Gulf Arab states as the allies he was talking about. Although Biden has made clear that he wants to resume the Iran nuclear deal, he's also used a formula saying that he wants to resume the deal as the starting point of formulating an additional or add-on deal that will address the things that this deal regrettably left out, which is Iran's aggressive behavior in the region and its missile program, which is what would is the point of the nuclear material that it's developing. And it's sort of natural that Biden has made this point. It's good he's made it. It's also a sort of natural point because the deal itself had a series of sunset clauses that is different parts of the deal due to expire. Some of them as soon as 4 years from now. So whatever your point of view, the question seems pretty self-evident. What's the point of getting back into a deal that's about to expire? That is, there needs to be some kind of new or amended deal. The other thing that may make this not so easy to achieve is the attitude of the Iranians. So the Iranian government's position is they will undo the things that they've done that they acknowledge are in violation of the agreement in terms of the further enrichment of uranium primarily. Once we have done the things that violate the agreement, namely the new sanctions that were applied under the Trump administration. But they also are demanding compensation, damages for the economic pain that they've suffered under these new sanctions. And they've recently put forward in an article by the foreign minister, Zarif, 7 conditions for that they're demanding that we meet if they're to undo the various violations that they acknowledge that they've done. And on top of that, this is an election year in Iran, and the The current Iranian president, Rouhani, is regarded as a representative of the moderate faction, and he may be, or his faction may be underdogs to the more extreme factions that have their own candidates to replace him as president. And that may make it, is likely to make it less, that Iran is less flexible in the negotiations that will have to be held in order to strike a deal to resume American adherence to this nuclear agreement. It still may happen. It still may be something that I, for one, would be very unhappy with, and I think the Israeli government will be very unhappy with. But it's far from a done deal, and I do think it's encouraging that that Blinken went out of his way to try to make this to at least put forward a position that he wants it to be done in close consultation with Israel, which would be a marked contrast to how the original deal was struck. Apart from that, I think as much as Trump was a great friend to Israel, there are some other ways in which, aside from the issues I've mentioned, that the Biden administration may be better for Israel. One of those, Biden seems less friendly to Erdogan of Turkey than Trump was, and Obama was. They both somehow liked Erdogan. There's no sign that Biden does. And also, Biden's theme, America is back, in terms of the world stage, I think is broad and vague, but very important. The sense of American withdrawal from the world, from the Middle East, was, I think, bad for the world, bad for America, and bad for Israel. And I think it encouraged Russia, notably, and also Turkey and Iran in their aggressiveness. And so the idea that America is back to a concept of internationalism as defining our foreign policy is something that is in various ways importantly to Israel's benefit. I think that's all I want to say, and that leaves a little time for others here to express their own views or to ask me questions. I'll stop right there.
There's stuff in the chat, I think.
Hmm?
There's some stuff in the chat.
Oh, I see. Well, first thing in the chat says, make sure you are muted. I'm trying. Maybe that was an expression of less than approval of whatever I was saying. I don't think it was aimed at. Natalie, how do you think the shift in the U.S. will affect the next Israeli election? Oh boy. It's a great question, Natalie. I don't think I can I don't think I can answer it. I mean, I read the Times of Israel every day, and every day it seems there's some new party that has broken up, and the leaders have gone to form some other new parties, and I really don't have any idea. I'm sorry.
Hey, Josh,
Yeah.
I know the part like Iran is it wants compensation in return for any agreements. I think compensating Iran is not acceptable. We should not give them a penny whatsoever, not one penny.
I don't, well, when the Obama administration cut that original agreement, we did have that, I thought, unseemly and embarrassing business of billions of dollars in cash being sort of secretly flown to them by the Obama administration. I don't think there is any likelihood that the Biden administration is going to agree to pay Iran some kind of reparations.
Not one penny.
Well, I agree with you that we ought not to give them one penny, and I also don't think we will.
And also, I think that Iran or future Iranian government should pay compensation to the hostages that they held from 79 to 81.
I'm with you there.
What's that? I think
I agree with you.
they should pay future Iranian government should pay compensation to the victims or maybe their heirs.
I agree with you, Hal, but I got to tell you, I don't even think the issue will come up. I think it is so far long ago, and so much else has happened since then with changes of their government and things we've done and things they've done. I think the issue of compensation to the hostages that were held won't even be on the table in any discussion.
I think it should be in future Iranian government if that regime is disposed one way or the other.
And I see another question here, Dave. This is David to everyone. So if anyone else says, can you please amplify your view that Biden is less of a threat to Israel than Trump was? I don't think Trump was. I think they're a very different president. I think I can say with confidence that Biden will be a very different president from Trump. I don't think either of them is or was a threat to Israel. I think they're in different ways. They're both friends to Israel, and I do think there's a big threat to Israel in the prospect of a nuclear Iran, and I am worried that the Biden administration will re-enter the deal without fixing it, and that it will make it easier down the road for Iran to become nuclear armed, and also that the prospect of an Iranian nuclear weapons capability, just the prospect of it, will encourage other regional states, including some who are friends to Israel at this moment, like, or at peace with Israel, like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, to also seek nuclear weapons. And those countries are countries where the governments can change. It will also encourage Turkey to become a nuclear weapons state. And I think the possibility of many Middle Eastern states becoming nuclear weapons states is a long-term significant danger to Israel. So it's something I'm very worried about. It would take too long to get off onto the whole subject. I'll just tell you, I'm at one extreme end of the array of opinions about this. I have been writing for 15 years that I don't believe there's any diplomatic solution and that we should take military action to deprive Iran of its nuclear weapons program. But I'm a kind of outlier in that view. Even the relatively more hardline U.S. administrations, that of President Bush and of Trump, neither of them took military action. I certainly don't expect that Biden will do that. But even though I'm skeptical of all these agreements, I would say it's obvious that there can be agreements that are tighter or looser in terms of the controls that they place on Iran. And if we re-enter this agreement without getting the kind of follow-on that Biden has said he wants, then we could end up in a situation that will make it easier for Iran to get to a nuclear weapon. There's been a bunch of chatter in the press that that Biden is considering naming Robert Malley as his whatever the title is, but the person in charge of the Iran portfolio. And that would be very dismaying to me. Malley has been in and out of the government a lot. He was during the Camp David negotiations between Barak and Arafat under the Clinton presidency. Malley was a deputy to Dennis Ross, our chief negotiator. And afterwards, when both Ross and Clinton himself stated very clearly that they blamed Arafat for the failure of the Camp David Accords to achieve the settlement, Malley was the one government official who came forward and said, no, Arafat's not to blame. Barak and Clinton at least share the blame or are more to blame than Arafat. And then he's also been an outspoken advocate of negotiating with Hamas and saying that any peace agreement has to bring Hamas in and Hamas can be brought in. So he has a much more optimistic view of people that I think of as enemies, both to the US and to Israel. and it would amplify or multiply my worries if Biden does indeed choose Mali to hold the Iran portfolio. But that hasn't happened yet, and a lot of times there's a new administration and there's jockeying between different factions in the public and in the side of the administration, and names get floated either to try to build them up or to try to shoot them down. So that name is floating out there, and it bears watching, I think.
Okay, this is Herb Grossman. As usual, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think you're a little too optimistic. For one thing, Blinken is part of Mali's circle, the International Crisis Group people. And Sherman is in the administration who negotiated that Iran deal. And aside from the defects you mentioned, there's also the point in the Iran deal in which facilities are off inspection,
Right.
Like Fordo, and so
Right.
it's pretty bad. And I agree that Biden is pro-Israel, very friendly to Jews, and certainly the opposite of Obama that way. But a lot of his people see things differently. And I don't think as optimistic a situation as you do.
Mm-hmm.
But that's but as to what the dangers are, I agree with everything you've said. So I see the world the way you see it, but I don't have the rose-colored glasses on. But you're in a public eye and I'm not, and so I think that colors what you say a little more than what I say.
I don't.
With that, I'll bow out.
Well, I wouldn't argue with you much. I do. It's true that the new deputy secretary is the woman who was the chief negotiator of the original deal, and I think she also before that negotiated the
North Korea.
dramatically unsuccessful deal with North Korea.
Oh.
Yes, it's not. We don't know what her role will be, and it probably will not be for the good. Although it's not a given that she'll be deeply involved in this. By tradition, the deputy secretary is more someone who sort of administers the department because the secretary is too busy to do that. So that remains to be seen. And Blinken, you alluded to someone else's background. I forget what you.
Yeah, no, Blinken, part of the International Crisis Group,
Right,
and a friend of Ben Ami's also.
Yeah, sure, he's but he's also his father was a big contributor to big donor to Commentary magazine, very close to my own heart, and as unyielding in defense of Jewish interests as any institution or publication. So yeah, but I grant you, we don't. This all remains to be.
Well, at least he means well.
He,
Blinken. and some of those people, whereas in the Obama administration, you couldn't say the same for Obama or for Kerry. You know, they're outright hostile to Jews and Israel. And yeah, but nevertheless, even if they're not anti-Jewish or anti-Israel, they can still do a lot of harm to Israel by the policies they take. And yeah, so anyway, you wear your rose-colored glasses, but I don't have them.
Okay.
Josh, it's Bill. I have a question.
Yeah.
It's Bill Eisenberg. I
Yeah.
have a question. So does the coldness or the warmth of the relationship at the political level affect the exchange of intelligence and forewarning when Israel would take military action? Does it affect Israel's ability or action of freedom? And does it affect the exchange of intelligence, the frostiness or the warmth of the relationship at the top?
The first part of your question, Bill, I just would be talking through my hat. I do not know. I've never worked in the intelligence field, and
Well, that's fair. That's fair.
you know, of course, I mean, it has to have some impact on it, but this is a world that is a world unto itself, and I've never been in it, and I just don't know. The second part of your question, I think insofar as Israel may make a decision to take military action of its own to impede the Iranian nuclear program, it is not going to discuss that in advance with the United States. I mean, it may discuss it in the sense that U.S. representatives may raise this issue and say, please don't do that. And the Israeli representatives would say, you know, thank you for giving us your opinion. But they're not going to do it in advance. Begin, when he took out the Iraqi Osirik nuclear reactor, did not give any advance information to the Reagan administration. And when Olmert took out the Syrian nuclear plant, he called President Bush immediately afterwards and said, you know, that thing that I mentioned to you that I was worried about is not there anymore. But no consultation in advance. And I think if Israel decides to act against the Iranian facilities, I don't, no matter how friendly the Biden administration may be, I don't see any possibility that they would inform them in advance.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you.
You know, there's
Josh,
always
I have,
oh, sorry.
Josh, in the run-up to the election, some of Biden's rivals from the, I guess, far left came together because they wanted to defeat Trump. Because of that, are there any IOUs hanging out there that could kind of muscle Biden into changing a fairly centrist policy?
I mean, I don't see that. He's a very political figure. He's the leader of the party. He wants to keep his party together. He wants to appease all factions, but the factions that stand to his left are much more significant than any that may stand to his right. So there'll be some of that, but I don't see the coin in which that appeasement, or maybe that's a loaded word, but in which favors will be paid to the left wing of the party. I don't see that coin being in the form
We're
of
not on mute.
Israel policy, or really very much in foreign policy in general. I think there are other things that have been championed by the party's left wing that have to do with domestic policy that is already bending over backward to please them about. The business of tremendous amount of affirmative action, the most diverse cabinet, or except they're all Jews, and there'll be other stuff in the economic realm, in terms of big deficit spending, $15 minimum wage, pro-labor things. I think the passions of the left are much more at this moment on those domestic issues, and that's where he'll try to satisfy them. And I think it's much less likely that even though the left will remain unfriendly to Israel, it's much less likely that he'll feel he needs to also appease them on the Israel issue.
Josh, one observation I have, I know it's getting close to the end for Mariv, but I think that if we soften our public stance from the administration head too quickly, our allies around the world, as least of all our adversaries, but our allies may feel emboldened to be a little less friendly to Israel. Nobody in Europe loves the Jews. I think they've taken positions that are good for them to take. And I'm speaking about France and Germany and UK and others, that any move made by a US government of either party that would begin to show overt friendliness when there hasn't been any real effort on the part of the enemies that we have in the Middle East to soften their position, such as the way they teach their children to continue hating, the way they continue to pay families in Palestine when their children successfully kill Jews in Israel. I think it wouldn't take a lot for our friends in Europe to become more hostile to Israel. We saw what happened with the attacks on the newspaper and on the bakery and all throughout Europe. It's clear our friends are not really friendly to Jews.
Well, I think that's a much more complicated.
I agree it's complicated. I just think that we should be careful that we look like we're going to be coming down too hard on Israel. That's all I'm talking about. It's a very tight rope that any U.S. president has to walk. I know that.
Are we starting the service soon?
We are, and I'm sorry I have to cut us off. And Josh, thank you for this
Political talk.
fantastic
Josh,
conversation.
thank you. Thank you, Josh.
Josh, thank you so much.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Wonderful, Josh.
He will continue this
See you next
discussion
week.
next week at 5:30 o'clock on Tuesday night. So thank you, Josh.